Welcome to another episode of Exploring Prosperity. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Per Bylund, whose groundbreaking work in entrepreneurship theory has profound implications for our understanding of economic growth. For decades, economists misrepresented and underestimated the role of entrepreneurship in our economy. Dr. Bylund's research reveals that entrepreneurship isn't just about starting businesses or self-employment. It's a fundamental market function that drives evolutionary process of our entire economic system. What makes Dr. Bylund's work so significant is that he's not just redefining entrepreneurship as a theoretical concept, he's redefining how we understand economic change itself, with major implications for how we teach economics and business, how we design policy, and how we identify and support innovation. This connects directly to our mission here at Exploring Prosperity. The consistently improving standard of living that humans have enjoyed since the mid-1700s didn't happen by accident. It's been fueled by entrepreneurial value creation that traditional economic models have failed to properly capture. The implications of Per's work are far-reaching. For business strategy, his research suggests market analysis is less relevant than imagining and creating entirely new markets. For institutional design, it points towards systems that foster permissionless innovation. And for entrepreneurial education, it suggests a fundamental rethinking of how we prepare the next generation of value creators. As someone particularly interested in how our expanding government apparatus impedes economic growth, I'm especially eager to explore with Per how regulatory frameworks and government spending redirect America's talent away from genuine innovation and toward bureaucratic navigation. Dr. Bylund is an associate professor of entrepreneurship and Johnny D. Pope Chair in the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. He's authored multiple books, including The Problem of Production, The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, and his latest work, Entrepreneurship and Evolutionary Economics, which promises to reshape how we think about the market process. I'm so glad to have you on Exploring Prosperity. I'd like to begin with the big picture. Economists often attribute historic economic growth to capital accumulation and technological progress or institutional reforms. But your work suggests that a major driver has been underappreciated or perhaps even misidentified. How much of the economic growth we've seen since the Industrial Revolution do you think should be attributed to your new definition of entrepreneurship? And how does that definition differ from how most economists and policymakers have traditionally understood the term?
Well, if you want to answer that truthfully, you're going to make me a lot of enemies in economics, I think.
Well, that's what we're here for.
So I think in general, I mean, there's a lot of research on economic growth and those processes and also capital accumulation, and they find pretty strong correlations. So in that sense, I mean, how much of it is something else? I mean, in these correlations, I don't think there's a whole lot of space for something else. The problem, though, is that those are about correlations, and they're not actually about the actual sort of essence of economic growth. And I mean, we're talking about prosperity, not just a simple metric of the size of the economy or that sort of thing. Of course, capital accumulation correlates with economic growth. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. The question, though, is where does this capital accumulation come from, and what does it facilitate in terms of value creation? Because that's what's important. You can accumulate a lot of capital, and you can assume that it is of value because it cost a lot to produce or because it used to be of value and things like that. Right? There could be a mass of tools for creating the best buggy whips you ever saw, but they suddenly have no value after, in this case, Henry Ford innovated the Model T because no one wants a buggy whip anymore. So that accumulation of those particular pieces of capital don't matter anymore. What really matters is, of course, where this capital can take us. So what can entrepreneurs create in terms of value, satisfaction, prosperity, using these tools, these machines, whatever else it is that we have discovered. So I mean, one thing that we're going to probably get to is the difference between a new technology and a new type of value creation, because they're not the same. And we tend to in economics sort of mix those two and not distinguish between the two. And that's because, of course, they correlate, because we tend to invent new technologies that we then use for innovations, or we have an innovation in mind, and therefore we invent whatever technology necessary to bring it about. But the correlation is there as an outcome of the process. It's not what drives the process, right? So I think the correlation in those statistical analyses that economists have done, thousands and thousands of, it's there, but it's there for a different reason than they probably assume.
Your approach to the idea of entrepreneurship is you've described it as a little bit more of a function rather than an identity. Tell us more about that.
Well, what we're really interested in the economy is not who is the person who does whatever, or how many people do this, or what type of tool, but rather what is the function in the economy, because we want to explain how the economic system works.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com. We're proud to be sponsored by Foundation. They've created Passport, one of the top-rated Bitcoin hardware wallets, proudly made in the USA. It's fully open source and air-gapped, meaning your Bitcoin stays completely offline and secure. The shocking Bybit exchange hack shows why holding some Bitcoin offline diversifies risk. Now they're launching Passport Prime, your all-in-one solution for not only Bitcoin, but all passwords and 2FA security. Head to foundation.xyz to secure your digital future.
And what is the dynamics of the marketplace and things like that. And entrepreneurship, an entrepreneur can start a business, an entrepreneur can innovate some new thing, an entrepreneur can disrupt what it was being done before and all these other things. And we sort of, in everyday language, we use the term for anyone is sort of a little bit adventurous or starts a business or does anything but climb the corporate ladder. And
that's absolutely true. The idea of it has really been broadened out to include people who want to start a dry cleaner in a town.
Right. And the thing is that usually happens with terms that have a very positive worth, right? That everybody wants to be that. Just like if you have a term that people connect with something really bad, no one wants to use the term for anything because that's not me, right? But if you want to be scientific and scholarly about something and actually explain something, you need to define it clearly and purposefully for a certain type of study. What do you want to explain? Okay, what do I need to explain it? And in that sense, entrepreneurship needs to be a specific function. And economists did this from the beginning. They talked about labor and capital and things like that. And those are functions. It doesn't matter who you are. You can be a laborer and a capitalist at the same time. But what matters is when you as a laborer do these things, what are the impacts and what are the wages you earn and things like that. And when you are a capitalist and invest your savings, what are the impacts on the economy, right? And of course, everybody who does that, and it doesn't matter how many or how few or whatever. And entrepreneurship is the same thing. It needs to be a function and not a statistic or a type of person or a sort of a mindset, as is sometimes being described as well, or the adventurous people and things like that. But an adventurous person doesn't have to actually create any value in the economy. An adventurous person can do a lot of bungee jumps, and that's about it, right? And then you can have someone who is not very adventurous, say a professor who happens to stumble upon a new discovery and then discusses with his wife or whatever and thinks that, whoa, wait a minute, this could be an interesting product, and then creates that product, and bam, that's a disruptive innovation. Well, there was no adventure involved at all, right? So we need to look at the process and the function of new value creation or innovation, to use a more well-known term. And that function itself, I think, is important, and it's core to understanding economic development and economic growth and prosperity generation.
Well, along with that, people think of entrepreneurs as risk takers, and you've pointed out that, well, that's one description, but there's a better one, which is uncertainty bearing, right? Why don't we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can distinguish risk from uncertainty because risk is sort of probabilistic. So you can calculate the risk and you can have sort of, that but 25% chance that it's correct. And then you can calculate perhaps using quantities as well. And I mean, that's what we do in everyday life in sort of, using fluffy terms. But in terms of creating a business, there's really no way of saying, I'm going to innovate and create this new value, and it has a 5% chance of being this valuable. That doesn't mean anything at all, because we have zero information, any reliable information at all, about how valuable it might get, when it might get that valuable, or if it stands any chance whatsoever. So uncertainty is this other part that it's unknown and unknowable. So we have to sort of just bear it and just try our best, which of course we should probably always do. But in terms of uncertainty bearing, there's no way of knowing, but we can have a hunch, we can imagine, we can have expectations, and then we have to make an investment basically in the dark because we can't know.
I started a company myself, and it was amazing day to day what you would predict could happen with high and low degrees of certainty, and how completely irrelevant it was to what the outcome was going to be. And it's this idea of calculated risk. It's a wonderful idea, and I guess the larger the companies, the more you can kind of have a pretty good feeling for what your sales are going to be next month because you have a process. But when you are talking about new companies, especially ones that are grappling with big new ideas, and then you also spend a lot of time talking about the idea of creating whole new markets where you can't sit down and calculate anything about it. It's either going to work or it's not going to work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in a sense, going back in economic sort of history of economic thought, entrepreneurship had this definition of uncertainty bearing in terms of value creation for a lot of very influential economists. But then economists sort of threw that out because how do you fit uncertainty bearing and a new value creation into a mathematical model? Well, you can't. And you also cannot study it statistically. So after the fact, you can see that, oh, look at that. These businesses were profitable and these new ideas seem to pan out and earn them profits. But you have no idea what they made their decisions based on after the fact. And of course, they can't tell you either because whatever they remember of it is at best a guess. Economics, in order to become scientific in a sense, had to throw out these ideas and throw out, in a sense, that the driving force of the whole market economy is not part of the study of economics anymore, which is just, when you put it like that, and I mean, maybe it's just a tiny bit exaggerated, but what then is economics discussing, and what are they studying? Well, they're studying a very narrowly defined, already sort of mature marketplace. So if you think of the life cycle of an industry, at the end of it, when you don't really have any new entrants, you don't have any innovations anymore, you just have these businesses competing, producing basically the same things, and they're competing on cost, and eventually the market is going to just implode, and there's going to be just one producer in the end who's going to also subside and die because no one is going to buy the product anymore. At that point, economic models fit perfectly. But where does the industry come from? Well, the industry comes from some entrepreneur successfully launching a new type of product or a new type of business or whatever it is into the marketplace and carving out a new space for this type of production that creates value for consumers. Well, that is just assumed in these economic models, which I think that's, to me anyway, is the most the most fascinating and then the most interesting part of what's going on in economies.
What you in your latest work, you leveraged off of your earlier work, and you talked about you split it into models of entrepreneurship. Is it was pretty interesting because you were adding different layers of unpredictability of where does the uncertainty come from, and it's probably worth explaining that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I use that as sort of a way of getting people on board with how, in a sense, everything changes if we talk about uncertainty. So there are theories of entrepreneurship today where entrepreneurship is seen as sort of just the arbitrage in the economy's sort of progression towards the law of one price. So in different places you can have this different prices for the same good. Well, then of course someone can say, well, I can buy at a low price here and sell it at a high price there, so I'll just do that, right? And that's of course going to equilibrate those two markets. And that's sort of the basic model of entrepreneurship. But arbitrage is not really new value creation. It is an important function. So I mean, don't get me
It's
wrong.
arbitrage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
you're making things a little more efficient.
Right, but it's also just exchanging with things that already exist. So it's nothing new. It's just changing the allocation of things. So what I do in model one is just say that, okay, well, let's say that we're not in equilibrium, which of course is always the case. But when we teach basic
You're just
economics,
setting up a laboratory, and we're going to run this. Yeah.
right? And in when you teach principles of economics, you tend to focus on equilibrium only. To try to sort of convey the intuition, and then many unfortunately get the idea that, oh, the economy is in equilibrium always, which then means that there is no movement at all, which doesn't fit at all with the real economy. So in the first model, I say that we're in disequilibrium, so we're not in equilibrium yet, but there are really no changes going on. So the only thing that is taking place is that entrepreneurs are reallocating whatever resources are used in production. So you have these production processes, they're already there, magically they're there. You have consumers, and you have these production processes are creating or are producing whatever consumption goods. Consumers' wants don't change, so the demand is basically the same. The question is just, are we using the resource in the right place and producing enough of each good and things like that. And then you have gains from arbitrage, from simply moving resources from where they are underutilized to where they are overutilized, or vice versa, and thereby try to get the most possible out of each and every one of them. And that's it's a form of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and value creation, because but I think you pointed out in the book that there's a calculable maximum in that as the profit margins asymptotically approach zero, there is a line that is the most that you can get from that system, right?
Exactly, and every gain is also permanent because we're in a situation where there's no change. Consumers are not going to change their minds. They're not going to be in new goods. They're not going to be in new supplies of resources or what have you. All of those things are sort of held constant. So we're only dealing with the arbitrage between these processes. So it's a simple model, and eventually it's going to take us to equilibrium just because of arbitrage. And then in model 2, what I say is, well, imagine that there could be exogenous changes, so changes to the economy or sort of to the context of the economy. So nothing is going to change from within the economy, but the economy will have to respond to changes like consumer change their wants. So maybe they used to want chocolate ice cream, but now more of them want vanilla ice cream. So of course then you have to change production a little bit and things like that. So arbitrage is still a thing, and it's still important. But now the gains are not permanent, because something can change. I mean, there can be an earthquake, or there can be a new fad, or consumers just simply don't want this thing anymore, or what have you. So whenever you have a gain, it's temporary. And this means that it's suddenly better for arbitrageurs to try to second guess, because since the gain is not permanent, being first and even being the only one to meet it before it's actually obvious to everyone means you maximize your profits. So they're going to try to guess more and not just respond to whatever they see. So this is more of a dynamic in there, but the process is the same. It's not going to actually lead to an equilibrium point because of these changes that can occur at any time. So it is a little bit uncertain what equilibrium actually is, because it is sort of a moving target. Now in Model 3...
And it includes this incalculable idea of, something can happen from the outside, you can't plan for it, and there's just an uncertainty there. And that tosses in some variability that allows these arbitrageurs to capture a little bit more and continue to move towards efficiency.
Exactly. And it introduces this fascinating thing that you can be already maximizing, whatever that means, but maximizing in your production process. But you can have a hunch that something is going to change. So maybe you should actually de-invest in that maximizing production process to instead invest in something else that you think that might actually be what consumers are going to go for next, right? So there's more of an active role for the arbitrager than there is in Model 1. And of course, that also means that they can lose a lot more money because they can make errors. Now, in Model 3, what I say is, well, it's not the case that they're only reallocating resources. So instead here, we can have entrepreneurs who figure, well, this might be a new type of a good that people would really benefit from, and I think I can serve consumers in this different type of way, or I can produce it in this different type, using this different type of technology, or this different type of process, or this different type of organization, or I can completely reposition the same type of product, but thereby make it more valuable for consumers and steal the market. So, one example that I've used in teaching is how Volvo, the car company, suddenly a few years ago said that we're going to stop selling cars. Instead, they're going to offer car subscriptions. So they're still going to produce the same automobiles. They're going to have a dealer's network and all this stuff. But the dealerships would be service providers for the subscribers to Volvo services. So they would take care of oil changes, they would take care of insurance, they would take care of all of these things, and you would just pay a monthly fee, and that would be it. They pulled the plug on it because apparently it wasn't successful enough, so now they're selling cars again. But it's a way of sort of reconceptualizing selling the automobile. It's exactly the same product. It's just a completely new business model for the product. And that sort of thing can completely, if it's successful, it's going to disrupt the whole industry. And that type of rethinking, even though it might not necessitate using new physical capital, new physical goods, or anything like that, you can just present it in a different way. That introduces uncertainty in Model 3, because suddenly not only do you have the opportunity for entrepreneurs to reconceptualize and rethink and reimagine how they can serve consumers, but it creates this problem for all of them. And you mentioned dry cleaner before. How adventurous is that? But any type of what the literature calls imitative entrepreneurship. So you're doing just exactly what someone else has been doing, but maybe in a new location, or you're just competing on price, or what have you. So it seems like a safe bet. It's not safe because the whole industry can at any point in time be disrupted by some entrepreneur who comes out of left field with a new idea. So
small bookstores.
Right. And we see this over and over and over and over again in the actual history of economics. We're used to the solutions that ended up winning, or at least thus far. So we don't even recognize what we lost out, or what other things there were. But there are some obvious examples. Small bookstores is one, right? And whoever created buggy whips or carriages for transportation with horses and things like that, saddle makers, all of those things were much, much more plentiful back in the day, but now we use automobiles, so we don't even think about it. And this introduces real uncertainty even for the quote-unquote safe businesses in safe industries, because they can't rely on there being a constant demand for the thing or service that they produce and provide. So they will then in turn, and then this is the punchline of Model 3, that the best defense of your business in the face of potential disruption is to innovate yourself, to thereby place the consumer first and try to serve the consumer to the best degree possible, the best way you can imagine, which of course has this interesting effect that you might be the disruptor. So just by defending yourself and trying to serve your consumers, you might actually be who disrupts everybody else's business. And therefore, of course, then you have an economy that constantly evolves very quickly too. It spins and creates new value in new ways constantly because of this pressure, whether or not anybody's actually trying to do it.
Well, you point out the role of imagination in some examples about markets that don't exist, and somebody comes up with the idea of creating that new market. Let's talk about the importance of imagination, and not just knowing what your customer wants today, but imagining things that they might want that they wouldn't even know about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem, right? If it were the case, I think Steve Jobs said something that you can't do product design using focus groups. And he was absolutely right. And I mean, Henry Ford has a quote where he says that had I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, but he had a different idea. And the issue is just that when you start production, that's a different time than when you conclude production, you have the product ready. And that's a different point in the sort of evolution of the economy as well. So how can you know today what you're actually competing with or competing against when you have the product ready? Well, you cannot. So the only way of trying to figuring that out is to figure out, okay, who is my consumer? What type of person in what type of situation? So in a sense, the function, right? Not the person. So it's not John down the street, but it's a person like that who is middle-aged, middle class, with a wife and 2 kids and that this type of life, right? So a persona of sorts. So this type of person, in a year when I'm ready, how can I best position this good or service or even tweak the designs or whatever to make sure that it is as attractive and valuable as possible for this type of person? That's the only thing you can do, because you're really not competing with what is out there today, but of course it should be inspired by it. What you're competing with is what other entrepreneurs are thinking that they can offer the same type of person at that future point in time. So you're imagining how to do a better job serving this person of the future than other entrepreneurs imagining to do the same thing.
Let's talk about some of the other implications for business and innovation.
One thing that I teach often is the relationship between value, price, and cost. And I think this is important because, to my mind anyway, the reason people, when they start businesses, and I'm trying to not call them entrepreneurs since that is the function, they tend to think of it in what we in programming used to call the waterfall model, right? It's from top down and it's just one direction and it never goes back. It's not iterative in any sense. So you want to produce a certain product, so you look at, okay, what type of machines do I need? What kind of facility do I need? How many people do I need to hire? What type of people? What suppliers do I need? What materials do I need? And then you sort of sign all those contracts. You go about doing that, and you have your costs, and then you calculate, okay, what is the cost per item I'm producing? And then you add your profit markup, and that's your price, and then you try to sell it. I mean, that's how a lot of people who haven't really thought it through, I would say, go about doing it. And that's how, in a sense, every entrepreneurship program at any university will teach you to not do this. I mean, plan through the process, yes, but don't do this. Try to figure out first, who is the customer and how is this of value to the customer? And value, I think we need to recognize, is really a subjective sense of satisfaction. So we can't really put a number to it. We can't really figure out how strongly you're feeling this. I mean, if I asked you, how many times better do you like oranges over apples? I mean, you go, assuming you like oranges more than apples, of course, that, well, I like them a lot more, or something like that, right? But you can't say this, well, it's 3.6 times more, because that doesn't mean anything. There's no unit. And that is the case for us as consumers when we buy goods and services, that we only rank them. And if we have $100 to spend, then we're going to get as much expected satisfaction as possible out of those $100 of purchasing power. But what exactly are we going to pick up? Well, we might not know ourselves when we enter the store. So we're sort of, in a sense, ignorant of our own wants. But it's also how we feel about these things when we use them. That is the actual value we get out of them, that satisfaction. So the price cannot exceed that value that we're getting. So, and the price, of course, then is whatever other satisfactions you can get from spending that money. So if you're selling something for $99, say, you need to offer more value than anything else that they can buy for $99 in their own terms, right? So you start with the value, and that gives you an indication of the price, because the greater the difference between the value and the price, the greater the consumer's profit. And of course, the higher the profit you're offering them, the easier it's going to be to sell something. Here is one place where education and sort of mentoring and guidance for entrepreneurs goes wrong, because they tend to focus on consumers' willingness to pay, and then you maximize the price to their willingness to pay. But that sort of assumes that the way we go about our lives in the world is, well, this thing I think is worth to me $99, but not $99.01, and everything is black or white. No, it's not. It's not the case that I'm going to value the satisfaction of getting this product equally if I get it for $99 or $90. Because $90 means I have the other $9 left, and I can get more satisfaction for that. So of course that's better for me. So that type of profit that you can offer, if the consumer thinks, oh, this is a good deal, whatever that means that they're getting a profit from the value they're getting from the product versus the value they could get from that money elsewhere. And the greater the profit, the easier it is to sell it. But what this means, of course, is that neither the value nor the price is really up to you as an entrepreneur. So that is up to the consumer. You need to figure out how to maximize the value for the consumer, and then discover what is the best price for the consumer to buy this product. And then your job as an entrepreneur is only in quotation marks, but it's only to figure out, how can I produce this thing at a cost that is lower than the price I can sell it at.
And it's hard enough to know what the price and the value are at this moment in time, when you could actually go ask people what they would be willing to do this minute. You could measure that. But if the production time is going to cause a delay before you can get the product to market, it compounds the uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in some cases it seems, well, it's not a lot of time. Well, just a little bit of time means that anything can change. But then you have many products, like a new model of an automobile, for instance, that can take 5 to 10 years from starting the designs to when you actually have the car ready to sell it in the dealer's lot. Well, if it's 5 years, I would definitely not invest anything in my ideas of what a car will be like in 5 years, because I have no freaking clue. And that would be an
Not to
easy...
mention your ability to make one.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Assuming I could make one. But it's just impossible, and it's a sure way for me to lose money, because I know nothing about this, and there's no way I could figure that out because you need to know the trends currently, and you need to know whatever technologies might be available, and that gives you sort of narrows it down a little bit, and it might give you an idea. The whole point is also that you cannot just follow that. You can't just extrapolate from the trends you're seeing. You have to go beyond that and imagine, okay, where can I take this? Right? So take control of it and say, well, these are the tendencies. These are the trends right now. So other entrepreneurs will try these sort of things and will have these types of things ready in 5 years. I think I can beat that. I can do something different. And I can do something different that is not just not what they're doing, but also better in the consumer's eyes. And then invest based on that. And of course, there's no formula for figuring out whether that's a good idea or not. And that's the uncertainty bearing we talked about.
It does get to there is a role for the personality type, that the person who's willing to bear that uncertainty with an idea, particularly if the vision becomes clear about a potential new market. I suppose Elon Musk is not a bad example here of an entrepreneur who has conceptualized markets that no one else had. I can go make spaceships better than, rockets better than governments can, when there had never been a private market for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we can see this with what is sometimes called serial entrepreneurs. I mean, it sounds a little too much like serial killer to me, but when they over and over again, they try different types of businesses and different types of entrepreneurship, and they're fairly or really successful over and over again, which means that they do have some kind of eye for what is going to happen. So, I mean, they can sort of see around the corner in a way that other people cannot. But to what extent is that simply that they are sort of masters of their trade in this very narrow area, like Steve Jobs in personal computing, or many of these people, they have this kind of ability, it seems, but it's also not, they're not flawless. So, I mean, they can lose a ton of money as well. And we do see, I think, a recent trend is that many people start businesses when they reach their 50s and 60s. So they have already been sort of climbing the corporate ladder in their due diligence, so to speak, within a business or an industry. And they've seen and they learned so much, both formal knowledge and processes and people and network and tacit knowledge as well. So they have a good understanding for things. And I think very often what triggers that they quit their jobs and start a business is that they have an idea for how to improve something that they have learned themselves. And they probably bring this up to their manager, and the manager says, shut up, do something else, go back to your cubicle, right? Because there's no place for that, and we already have a business that works well or whatever, right? Like the typical manager's response. And then they go like, I'll screw this. I can make a killing off of this and make this happen, right? And then they quit their business, and they use whatever contacts they have and all these other things, and they start a business, and they can disrupt things entirely. And it can be boring little things that no one ever thought of, but they can change things entirely. And one example,
service industries are particularly ripe with this, because you have an individual who has several clients, and they're large paying clients, and already that you've satisfied them and they're going to stay with you. And so it's somewhat, I come from the financial industry, and there's plenty of that. There's plenty of people going out on their own and starting ventures that don't have to become large, and sometimes do, because they're actually just executing in a somewhat better way. Either that's with a less onerous bureaucracy. Very often it's just flexibility and ability to satisfy customers faster that allows that.
Right. And that has a lower threshold, of course, because you can use that personal trust in order to get started. Of course, the backside of it is that it's also hard to scale up if it's based off of your own personal trust and connections. So I mean, it's both good and bad. I mean, it's an easier way to start, and an easier way to start without getting indebted and start making money right away. Like you said, you can just stay small or stay medium sized, and
but the capital required in the service industry tends to be very low.
Right.
So you don't
But
need
you can also,
successful.
in a sense, one of the things I did in my dissertation, which is a long time ago now, was look at how, in a sense, industry structure changes over time. So one of the ideas I had, and you mentioned the problem of production, that sort of something came out of the dissertation. One thing that I looked at was how is it that industries tend to start with everything integrated within a business, but then they start to fall apart and start outsourcing things. And then they become more and more focused through this process on the actual value creation, because they don't have to integrate all this other stuff that they needed to from the beginning, but that was just because there was no infrastructure, economically speaking, right? So, but with more entering the space and competing with them, they can just outsource this and then they outsource that. And how does that process actually happen? And the sort of obvious answer, at least at first, was that, well, of course, the entrepreneur realizes, well, now the time is ripe that I can just let the accountants go and I can buy a service from them or what have you. Turns out when I started interviewing people, and I never actually got to complete this project because it required an NDA that was just horrific. But it turns out that no, there are people who start businesses that are focused on helping other businesses outsource their internal functions. So it's not the case that these businesses, because of course an entrepreneur is biased towards keeping control of the business. Of course. I mean, in a sense I was stupid because I knew this. But they want to keep every bit and piece under control so that they can continue running the show. Outsourcing something means that you're dependent on someone else doing that part. But these other businesses, and I was talking to specifically an IT firm in India, and what they did was they basically had developed measures and metrics for how to identify that a business was sufficiently mature that they could approach them and say, hey, we'll save you money if we take over your IT department. So they approached these businesses from basically out of left field, out of nowhere, and said, hey, we can help break up your business and save you money in the process, which I thought was fascinating. And thinking about it, of course, that's what must happen. But that's another way of disrupting industries, right? That you see that, well, wait a minute, this is a function that I think businesses will have, but that is not core to their actual operations. So I can offer this service and I can approach them when I think they're ready and offer them a deal they can't resist, because the cost of using my service instead of having it in-house is so much lower.
I think this is, there's another reason that if you go back far enough, outsourcing wasn't as popular, and that was that the outsourcing industries hadn't fragmented. You didn't have a wealth of opportunities to outsource, and one by one, after several years, you had this industry start, and I guess accounting would have been, well, maybe not accounting, but HR became big. Every function of a business began to have experts leave and start. The executive search business was a classic one. You would go out and hire people to run your businesses, and then a few people got pretty good at that and started being able to serve in great candidates, and all of a sudden it became an industry. And they tend to just continue to get larger and better. And so it's easier and earlier that businesses can outsource. And today, advancement of the internet, it's amazing the proliferation of services that can be outsourced by small business people. And entire businesses can be set up now with very few people and grow to be very large. I was at a conference recently, and the keynote lunch speaker was an engineer. He was a software engineer. He worked for a number, he gave the number, but he had 19 employees plus himself. And they went into hard times for some reason. And he had to survive. In order to survive, he had to fire all 19 people. And then he realized he could outsource people and scale to his customer growth. And that's what he wound up doing. And he became very successful at it. And at the time I saw him speak a year ago, he was dismantling that because he could use AI to write his code and he didn't need people anymore. And he said, I'm only a few months away from being able to run this company that used to be 250 outsourced software engineers with nobody, just me. And I think that that's one of the telltale signs of the ability for our economy to continue to advance. It's this fragmentation of specialization that is available to smaller and smaller and smaller organizations.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, this is something that even Adam Smith identified. How through the division of labor, we get so much more productive because we focus our efforts. And that applies to both us as individuals and to organizations too. And you should focus on, he didn't quite get this point, but you should focus on the value creation for your customers. And I think that AI, I mean, that's definitely a huge disruption in the economy, is going to be one. I mean, it's not even near, today, I don't think we can even conceive of how big it's going to be probably. It's going to change a whole lot of things. But instead of fighting it, what we should do is let AI relieve us of those boring tasks that we don't have to do. And instead, I mean, in a sense, what I'm thinking is that all of this development of new technologies, whether they are new machines that can relieve us from a manual labor, or if it's something sort of software based like AI or what have you, all of these are just taking the manual, repetitive, boring parts out of work and leaving us with the entrepreneurship core of it. And I don't think we're ever going to run out of jobs. We're going to run out of jobs where we use our bodies to lift stuff, or use our bodies to push stuff, or use our minds for, in a sense, I think in the future they will think that stupid things like write code for a software, or to
fill out forms, all
Right.
of the stuff that drives us crazy every day and takes up way too much of our time.
Right.
If the world imagined without that, you can actually focus on the things that you're good at and that you want to do.
And we're so afraid of these things, and then we so quickly adapt and adopt them. So how many people now would say that, oh, it's terrible and it's cheating to use the features in your word processing software that autocorrects misspelled words? Well, you were used to dictate to a secretary who typed it up, and then you would go through it with a pencil and find all the errors and all the changes needing made, and then give it back to her, and she would type it up again.
In those days.
Right. And you would use this, you would white out the mistyped ones. I mean, I've used typewriters too, and then you write over it, but you can only do it once or twice, because then you have to start over because the paper is all just wet and all this crap. Right. But now, no, you just type, and if you type something wrong, it doesn't really matter because the software is going to fix that for you. No one is saying that this is cheating, or that this destroyed jobs and this is going to cause a terrible future. No, it's quite the opposite. And now we're all used to it.
Why don't we talk a little bit, because you have also about government and its role in this entrepreneurship function.
Yeah, right. So if it is the case that the entrepreneurship function is what I claim it is, then it is really the imagining of how to serve consumers best, and that's how you maximize the profit, by simply maximizing the profit for consumers. Then what the government does, I mean, if you just go to regulation straight away, what a regulation does is limit the scope of what you can imagine, or what you're allowed to imagine, I should say, not can. What the effect of that is, of course, is, well, if you have all these people who are all free to imagine how to serve you the best way possible, you the consumer, and then there's a regulation saying that, well, you can't really think about anything over here because that's out of bounds. That's not allowed. Well, what that means is that whoever thought of a way to serve you that uses something in that space, or that depends on it in some way, or squarely fits in that space perhaps, cannot do it anymore. So that entrepreneur will instead say, okay, I'll do something else. And of course, that's going to be something of lower value, because otherwise they would have chosen this something else first. So they have to choose something of lesser value. Or they might just say that, okay, well, if I can't do that, then there's not really a point. I don't know what else to do. So then whatever resources you would have used in your production of this service, they will be available to some other entrepreneur. But that other entrepreneur would be someone who would not be able to acquire those resources had you been able to pursue that other service. Because that guy would have been able to outbid you for everything. So you would have not been able to start. So in both cases, you would end up with some type of production that is of lower value to consumers. And I mean, that is the immediate cost of any regulation. And whether it's worth it or not is a different issue. But the cost means that we have less value creation and therefore less prosperity in the world, which is kind of an enormous cost, especially considering how innovations, we sort of briefly touched on this before, but when you imagine how to serve consumers to the best extent possible, of course you're going to look at what is around you, what trends are there, what technologies are there, what can I use? Well, and then your investment means that you realize a certain type of production process. So you might develop a new type of machine, or you might combine a couple of machines and you show that, oh, this works. Well, that becomes the inspiration for the next generation of entrepreneurs, of course, when they imagine how they can serve consumers and probably and hopefully outcompete you. Well, if it is the case that a regulation then causes entrepreneurs overall to create less value, so we're on a lower trajectory, well, that means that the productive apparatus of the economy will be directed towards that lower value, which means that the imagined future solutions will be inspired by this lower trajectory. So we're on so that means that they will be able to create less value as well than otherwise would be the case, which then of course means that we're on a constantly lower trajectory, probably a lower slope, just because of this one regulation. And I think when it's so easy, especially from a politician's perspective, just say, we need to regulate this, we need to regulate that, we need to stop that, prohibit that, and get rid of that problem. And that sounds easy. But when the cost of each and every one of those is that society will be on a lower trajectory in terms of prosperity because of each one, and that is the cost of that one regulation, well, then it's not that easy anymore to say that, oh, it's so easy to just get rid of these problems. And I haven't even mentioned, of course, that regulations tend to not actually solve the problems that they are intended to solve. That's a different matter, and I think that is fairly well understood. But just recognizing what entrepreneurship actually is, the new value creation for future consumers, and therefore that a regulation sets us on a constantly lower trajectory, that means that the cost of any regulation is enormous. So we need to be really, really careful to figure out which regulations are worth it, and and how many of these regulations that we have should we never have had. And of course the other question is how poor are we compared to where we otherwise would be. And that's the unrealized in the other book that you mentioned, the seen, the unseen, and the unrealized.
It also seems that regulatory rules ought to be set by the politicians who are earning the votes of the people, rather than growing bureaucracies of unelected people, which I think has been the mark of this growth in executive power over the last 5-6 decades is that the executive branch has gotten dramatically large and loaded with these regulators who are really able to continue to write rules and regulations that are now really insulated from the voters' ability to respond or object.
Right, and we already had the problem that, well, how can you tease out what the effect of the regulation is? Because at any point in time, say we have a completely free market, and now we impose a regulation today. Well, that means that the future is going to be the future with the regulation. We don't know what the future without the regulation would be like. So we never know what we're missing out on. So that problem we already have. And now, what you added to the picture now is also that, okay, well, now we have also no accountability whatsoever. So for those who impose these regulations, there is no and can be no cost. But rather the opposite, right? That these agencies, they get a larger budget the more they have to, quote unquote, regulate. So the incentive is for them to impose more regulations, and there's really no accountability before how crazy they are or how destructive they are. Not to mention, of course, that what is the prosperity that we're not getting because of these regulations. And just to be clear, I mean, and you're absolutely right to talk about prosperity rather than economic growth, because it opens to what we're actually talking about. And as an economist, I tend to say economic growth, which confuses people to think is just GDP. But what is prosperity? Well, it's such things as curing cancer or living longer, healthier lives. And if that is what we're giving up in order to have a bureaucracy regulate the economy, I mean, then that simply can't be worth it.
Exactly. So what I asked earlier on about whether there's a way that you can look back based on your work and have a sense of how much economic growth is attributable to what you've identified as this economic function. Is that something you're able to do? I mean, you tend to focus a little bit more on the micro analysis rather than macro, and this is certainly a macro question, but do you have a sense for that?
Not really. And I mean, we just talked about regulations, and that introduces added complexity to I don't know to what degree, but an enormous degree. But in a sense, I think what you could argue, without necessarily being very wrong, is that all of these things that we're seeing always start with new value creation. So everything that we have around us is the effect of it. Then, of course, we have, like in the models 1 and 2, we have a lot of arbitrage and reallocation and things like that too. But that's not the new creation of productive capabilities. And I don't mean productive capabilities necessarily as in quantity output, but in terms of value output, new types of things, new types of services, new ways of satisfying people. And all of that is originally innovation or entrepreneurship.
So where do we go from here? How can your work be put to work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for myself, I'm just trying to figure out the implications of it, and I imagine that the implications are just vast, enormous, and I haven't figured out exactly what they are. And of course, as an academic and scholar, what I need to do is figure out exactly the details, specifically step by step, sort of what is going on. And I think what is maybe not next in line, but that is in the foreseeable future is a new theory of economic growth. So I mean, I appreciate the question, but how much of this prosperity we have is due to this function? Because it forces me to think, okay, well, how can we use this function to explain the process and the actual increase in this generation of prosperity? And that's something that has to happen, I think, because the the models of growth and also the metrics of growth that we have are, in a sense, terrible. Yeah, they're not even close.
Yeah, it also feels like 6 decades ago it would have been harder to identify this. 4 decades ago you could begin to see it. 2 decades ago it was starting to really get real. Today, it's so obvious that an enormous amount of economic value is being created by a relatively few number of companies that have been able to have the capital and the ingenuity to have big ideas and draw a lot of economic activity into their systems. And so now it's even more obvious that there were things that were being imagined that models weren't capturing.
Right, and I think, in a sense, this idea or this approach, I think this is really where economics should be in trying to figure this out, because this is much more important than the analyses of statistics and things like that they're doing, or trying to figure out exactly what interest rate the Federal Reserve should try to enforce and things like that. I think where this becomes really, really important policy-wise is the question of unemployment, really, for the future, because now we're on the cusp of the AI revolution. And I mean, AI is such a broad term, so I'm not sure exactly what that means even. But where we have these softwares that are generative in some sense and can take over all these repetitive tasks for white-collar workers. Blue-collar workers have already seen a lot of inventions and a lot of automation, but now white-collar workers are affected by the same thing. And so, of course, everybody's really upset and fearful for their jobs, not because they love their jobs, but because they want an income. And that's why we have this discussion about guaranteed incomes and things like that too. Instead, to have the discussion and recognize that what creates value is the imaginative entrepreneurship of people. And it doesn't have to be someone who is a daredevil and someone who is just like Bill Gates or just like Elon Musk or some star like that. It can happen in very small scale. And you mentioned
Exactly.
you mentioned before that, well, what we're seeing now is that you can do all this stuff online. And yes, very often it's just about figuring out how can I make certain types of people's lives better, and then you can pull things together online. You can send an order to a factory producing some certain thing in China and another factory doing some certain thing in Mexico, and then there are shippers and logistics firms available, and they will help you with that. And you can just click, and you can make it happen from your own garage, or you can sit in the sun by the pool and have a drink and do it at the same time. But figuring that out, I mean, that is a job, and that type of entrepreneurship is something that we all have ideas basically every day of how the world would be better. So it's not the case that we're going to run out of ideas or anything like that. What we're seeing now is really that the threshold to do these things and actually realize these ideas that we have are so low and getting lower by the minute that this is where the future of work is. It's in the human ingenuity in imagining how to serve one another, basically.
And we can reconnect it back to this idea of arbitrage too. Now the economic opportunity gets smaller and smaller and smaller that any one person can see and find, and it's sufficient to pursue. And that is also enormously enabling of the global economy. And the other thing that's obvious about the internet is it's global, and so we've unleashed billions and billions of people to be able to compete in the United States who could never do it before.
Exactly.
And are very effectively competing. I imagine that another element that you've talked about is simply measuring growth, measuring a lot of things that are happening in the economy. Once you start understanding it this way, it becomes pretty obvious that we're not measuring everything that we should be measuring, and especially the important stuff.
Yeah, we're measuring the wrong things and we're not measuring it right. So that what is the GDP statistic about? And I mean GDP has so many other problems with it. I mean it basically measures cost, assuming a value, whereas what matters is the value. And then you choose the cost to create the value, but the value justifies the cost. It's not really relevant. It's relevant for your profits, but that's why people choose them. So it's not really an issue there. And the cost that goes into producing something has not really any relationship or correlation with the value produced. So all these metrics and everything, they're completely worthless in a sense. I'm reminded by Joseph Schumpeter, the economist. He had a really fancy way with words. I mean, he's the one who coined creative destruction and terms like that. And he has a statement where he says that in an evolutionary system like the market economy, or he called it a process of industrial mutation or something like that. He says that you can't at any moment in time really measure its size or its change. You can't really assess it at any point in time. What you have to assess is where it's taking us. And since the process itself is unfolding and is creating new levels and new ways of satisfying consumers all the time, you can't really pinpoint any level at any point in time. The only thing you can do is say, well, look at this. Today compared to 10 or 100 years ago is much better. Right? And that's the only thing you can say. So economic growth, according to this certain statistic, is 1.8% higher than last. It doesn't mean anything at all. And I mean, even assuming that people are pretty okay with their statistics, it doesn't mean anything in their everyday lives. But saying that, well, how did you live your life in 1970 versus now? That's a big difference. Or comparing a country that is further along in terms of economic development versus one that has not barely started yet. Lives in those places are so different. And that's where we can say that, well, look at this. It has created all this prosperity and the standard of living, not in GDP terms, but in actual appreciable personal terms, is so much higher. And we're living longer lives, healthier lives. We have more spare time. We have more choices. We have more purchasing power. We have more vacations. We have more whatever we choose to have. I mean, that's what it is about. And that's just glorious. I mean, what we have created over the past 300 years or so is just so fantastic.
It's funny because the reason that I started this mission of mine called Exploring Prosperity is simply that, ironically, that seems to be very self-evident, that if you go back every 5 and 10 years, kind of on any metric, it just looks better and better and better, and until you get to about 275 years ago, and then it starts getting a little choppier. But today there is record pessimism among Americans about the prospects for the next generation, and it seems people are so focused in their recent experiential experience that it's easy to overlook how far we've come. I am sponsored by a company called Trueflation, and they undertook just a few years ago, the idea that the CPI is self-proclaimed to be an estimate of inflation. And they decided to start cataloging all of the prices that they could get their databases on. And so they now are monitoring almost 100 million pricing data points. Most of them are updated daily all around the world. And they can tell you exactly what the prices of the basket of the CPI has moved by. And they can tell you the same thing for anywhere else in the world of all of these items. And they can adjust the basket of goods according to whatever measure any of their clients want them to. The point of that is that the divergence from the CPI is astonishing. And it's just astonishing. Right now it's running in the low 1% range. But the markets and the people monitoring the economy have this tool. Many of them buy it, and none of the markets operate off of it. They operate off of what the government tells you the CPI is, and then the government will just adjust it randomly going backwards. And so I think it's just a matter of time before everybody starts paying more attention to what, if you want to know what prices are doing, you can actually measure it.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of prices. I mean, they're objective and they're out there. So it should be easy. I think it's many of these statistics, they start out as sort of innocent and intended to be good. I mean, GDP was the same thing when Simon Kuznets invented it. I mean, he was trying to capture the size of the economy with the assumption that, well, the production apparatus, that is what creates these goods and services that are our standard of living. So if the production apparatus grows, then all else equal, we would be better off. Which is, I mean, it's not a bad idea. Of course, it's really, really difficult to capture. And he did an okay job, and people started adopting it, and he got the Nobel Prize and stuff like that. But then, of course, when the statistic is already in place and used, then you have every incentive to tamper with the statistic rather than change the world, because that's so much easier. So now, of course, China is focusing on using how GDP is calculated in order to boost GDP growth. I mean, standard of living be damned, it doesn't really matter, but GDP growth is really important for the prestige of the regime and whatever. And I mean, it's not only China. China, they just can do it to a greater extent, but every country is doing that. Of course, and of course we're including government spending in GDP. Well, that means the government can just spend a ton of money and then GDP is up and we have economic growth. Well, no, it's the opposite, because if government spends a lot on some kind of silly nonsense that no one wants, that's resources that could be used by entrepreneurs to create goods and make our lives better. That's a negative. It's not a positive. So I mean, then the statistic doesn't mean anything at all anymore.
Exactly. Are there other things that we haven't covered that you want to
I think there. I mean, I think we covered the gist of it, the main stuff. There's so much more here. I mean, in terms of implications, that, like I said, I haven't figured it out yet myself. So I'm not sure to what extent I can talk about it.
Well, for any viewers who have implications that come to them that you think Professor Bylund should be investigating, please reach out and contact him. And for any companies that would like to incorporate your thinking into how they innovate, where can everybody find you?
Well, I am, as an academic, of course, they can find me on the university's website, so okstate.edu. I'm very active on X, so I make sure to post something there pretty much every day. And I dedicate the account to discussing, well, these types of issues and economics in general. So whoever is watching this would sort of feel welcome, I think, in my X or Twitter feed. Other than that, I publish a little column here and there in different times, but nothing really regular.
Thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation, and with any luck, we'll get government policymakers to start rethinking how they approach all of this data and how they approach regulatory encroachment, so that we can free up as much as possible the human ingenuity that's being freed by the free market.
Well, that sounds like a really good idea. Let's hope that happens. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. Hey, if you like this clip, please hit the subscribe button. You might also want to check out some of the clips I've posted with my many other guests. My interviews all address the simple question, how screwed are we? We ask experts about the problems that make Americans so pessimistic today, but we also explore why there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspective on today's challenges and opportunities.